This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 357, and it's October the 6th, 1978. We'll get right into the discussion of the House Select Committee on Assassinations in a few seconds. I do want to mention that Jack Anderson had a column yesterday, October the 5th, 1978. I hope you all saw it. If not, try to get a hold of it, called Patty and the CIA. And he goes into the allegations. He asks the question, did the Central Intelligence Agency unwittingly inspire the kidnapping of Patty Hearst? And he talks about a convict named Clifford Jefferson who was told by Donald DeFreeze that he was given tests at Vacaville. Both of them were in Vacaville together in 1971 and 1972. And that DeFreeze said he was part of a CIA controlled test, that they gave him tests, put him on the third floor of the facility, B3, where he met men from the CIA that gave him drugs, mescaline, quaaludes, and artane. First he got frightened, then he relaxed, and they told him that he was going to lead a revolutionary group, kidnap a rich person, hold the person in a dark place, give them mescaline and drugs, and turn them into robots to do anything that he would ask them to do, including killing other people. And he left Vacaville prison. This is what Jack Anderson said in late 72. And he begins to talk about Vacaville State Prison as being the place where the MK Ultra program was going on. Of course, Jack Anderson said that he spoke to Warden Superintendent T. Lawrence Clanon, C-L-A-N-O-N, who said that there was no experiments after 1968. Of course, that's an outright lie, and I'll send the information to Jack Anderson because they were doing experiments and lobotomies, and they're still doing drug experiments on people, or at least when the tests are over and how they're using the results. They also Jack Anderson questioned how Donald DeFreeze would know they were in the CIA, since he said, in quotes, the CIA involvement in experiments wasn't known until August 1976. Well, that's not true. I wrote an article for the Berkeley Barb in April 1974 titled, Is Donald DeFreeze the First Black Lee Harvey Oswald? And I'll send it to Jack Anderson. And men that I was corresponding with in the prison and the studies that I was doing on the California prisons and the UCLA schools and the hospitals in California was clearly indicative that the CIA was involved, and we knew it, and I knew it long before Senator Church Committee admitted it was happening. It was in 76 that they admitted it, and Jack Anderson wonders how DeFreeze knew. But DeFreeze worked for the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department that was directly involved in conspiracies and murders and mind control, and he was then sent up to Vacaville. But it's very important to see this story unfold because I've been out on a limb as a researcher on the SLA is the CIA. There are many people working on the Kennedy assassination. There are people that came behind me with support in the Watergate story, but the SLA story has basically been a long, hard, lonely road trying to tell people the way that Patty Hearst was kidnapped. I'm happy to say that I've been in contact by telephone very, very frequently, Reverend Dumke, Patty Hearst's minister. In fact, I got a letter from Patty Hearst last week, and about 10 days ago, Reverend Dumke called me fervently, quick, get to your file, send me information to prove that the CIA was in Vacaville in 1970 and 71. And I was busy transcribing tapes from the House Select Committee. He called back, and I got into my file, sent him a lot of material, and Reverend Dumke is in Washington, D.C. right now, and I'm happy to have played a part and will continue to play a part with this saga of the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. The tape that I did, number 355, September 22nd, it talks about the Evel Younger connections to the DeFreeze SLA setup, and I mentioned in there the mental hospitals that turn people into psychopathic personalities to kill and pillage the villages at home, and referred to the California zombies. You're going to see a lot more coming out in the turning of Charlie Manson in the prison into a zombie, the way Donald DeFreeze was. This is going to come out in the Rolling Stones trial that I'll be a witness. They're suing Paul Krasner, Charles Winan is, and Rolling Stones for an article Krasner did. But it's going to be a fascinating trial, and as far as I know, it'll be in San Francisco around November the 27th. But this is going to be another crack in the wall of the California zombies. And again, I'm proud to say that I was the first person, the first researcher, as a private person, an individual, to break these stories, to write about them, to talk about them on the air every week. And we're going to get a crack into these stories, the Zodiac killings and the California violences, and then you can apply them to your own territory outside of California. But I'm excited. I hope it doesn't, the story doesn't drop of the SLA as the CIA, and I'll begin to send more information to Jack Anderson about the doubles Donald DeFreeze has and how he left Soledad, that his experiences just didn't include Vacaville, but had a lot of connections to the CIA. I do have the tape cassettes I made in August 18th and August 25th. The SLA is the CIA, but I don't have enough money to send duplicate tapes around the country. If any of you want to donate those tapes, you can write to me to the Tape Center, and we'll send them to Jack Anderson, these cassettes on the SLA, the ones that I did. I just don't have the cash to send duplicates of these shows around the country, even though they're important. There's a limit with subscriptions and material I have that I can't send them out. But if any of you want to send those tapes, or those of you that take these tapes, just dub them off. There's no copyright. Take your tapes and send it off to Jack Anderson and various people in Washington, D.C. I briefly passed off the death of the Pope last week, a casual remark, hardly hard research, but just the impression that he was just too peace-loving to ever survive that game there, that John Paul just couldn't make it in that jungle of warfare state that we are in continuously. But during the week, people were calling talk shows on the radio, investigate the Pope. The Pope was murdered. This would never have happened 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. Just never would have happened that anyone except May Brussell would have even gotten on KGO and said the Pope was murdered or a plane was sabotaged for a particular person. But the newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, and probably your newspapers too, carried stories about an Italian newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, with an editorial saying, "Why no autopsy?" And they noted that a Chinese cardinal, Yu Pin, went to see Pope Paul, the funeral of Pope Paul VI, and collapsed and died a few days later. That a gentleman from Leningrad, the Metropolitan Nicodem of Leningrad, died a month ago while having a private audience with Pope John Paul. And the paper went on to say, a Russian, a Chinese, and then the Pope himself. Coincidences? But never in recent times have there been so many deaths of such a sudden nature and so close to the Vatican. Suspicion is flowing through Rome, already so full of suspicions, and is entering the Vatican. Not even the throne of St. Peter is safe. And that is from the San Francisco Chronicle, October the 4th, 1978. I also talked about the airplane that the lieutenant governor was supposed to be on, that crashed in San Diego, called America's Worst Plane Crash. Just a few headline stories this week. The PS pilot's words baffle the crash probers. They can't figure out. There was a theory that a third plane was involved, and they can't figure out what he was saying, and they're baffled by what he was saying on the line. Another article says, inquiry brings more puzzles. The farther they go, it says, the more confusing it is. We have more questions than answers concerning a crash that killed 150 persons. The more we know, the less we know. And that's the way it usually is in some of these mysterious plane crashes. They're not so clear-cut. There also was an article the same day of this one saying answers lead to more questions about Mike Kerb, who I mentioned on the tape last week, on tape number 356, that he had a part in this pornographic movie, and this story has been going on in the news, larger stories. If Merv Dimely were dead, I'm sure the Kerb story of the pornographic movie wouldn't come out. Also interesting that there was a photographer taking a picture of this airplane. It reminds me of the Abraham Zapruder film at Dealey Plaza. There's a gentleman there who just happened to take a very good picture of this plane that was crashing, and I don't know how many people have ever done that. His name is Hans Wendt, Hanswendt, and they called it the best photograph ever taken while on another assignment, the best crash picture that they've ever seen, that they can pinpoint the reason why the pilot lost control of the plane. He's a professional photographer. He's not a newsman. He took a full view of the right side of a falling plane and recorded it by the camera, which I thought was quite interesting that somebody was there taking this airplane. It crashed as the plane went into it, and then crashed. I just wonder if the small plane was a kamikaze with instructions, and the photograph taking it from down below had anything to do with recording for future robots. Were there robots involved, and were they recording the event? You have to ask the most outlandish questions to do this research. I think that's why I've come as far as I have. I'm not afraid to ask if the Justice Department COINTEL program would in fact kidnap the daughter of Randolph Hearst. When you think the most outrageous and then you begin to collect all the evidence, you can always rule out these terrible, nasty thoughts. But it's only possible to solve some of these things when you ask the most outrageous questions. And of course, when that crash went down in San Diego, I said, was it because the lieutenant governor would have been killed, and then we would have had a different political system in the state of California? This is a big state, and as I said on that tape when I talked about Evil Younger, this is the first para-fascist state, described as a para-fascist state, so why wouldn't you have a few little crashes if you could get in a new regime? Now, I'm not accusing Mike Kerb of planning this crash or even know anything about it. But there may be people behind him putting up for his campaign that are anxious for him to be in because he will serve their interests more than Lieutenant Governor Donnelly, and therefore they can arrange it. He may not even know anything about it, but would succeed and take over as Lieutenant Governor. Good Morning America this week, one morning, the week of October the 2nd, either October 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, two men from the House Select Committee on Assassinations were on the program, Richardson Pryor, Here Comes the Judge that I described last week from North Carolina, and Louis Stokes, chairman of the committee. And I'm sure they were hoping that at the end of 1 year, they could tell the American people, eyeball to eyeball, that we spent $6 million and that all the evidence is turned in, and your 80% doubt of the Warren Commission is now restored. You have confidence in your institutions. We did a wonderful, thorough, complete job. All the critics have been answered, and we're very proud of ourselves. But they got on the program, and it was admitted on the program, or they were challenged with the fact that fewer people believe the Warren Commission and believe them now than did before the committee started. So we've spent $6 million and seen a bunch of liars and fools, and the country still believes less, and that partly is due to all of you people that are sending me copies of letters that you're writing, wires that you're sending, and response from radio shows that I've been on or other researchers have been on. I know I've been on a lot. And just keep it up. Just flood them with information so that when they write their crummy report in December, because I'm sure it's already written anyway, let them know what you think about them, and just keep it up, and let the people in this country know by, as I say, calling talk shows and writing letters to the editor if you can, just how we get ripped off, because right now the polls are conclusive in showing that these people are lying to us, and that's just great. On KGO Talk Show this week, Seth Kanner, who wrote a book about Jack Ruby, was on, and he was talking about the assassination of John Kennedy when a caller called. He didn't give his name. He said he couldn't give his name, but he's a member of the Minutemen, that notorious group of people that were named by Louis Tackwood as being part of the San Diego plan, the Squad 19, to help kill Richard Nixon, make Spiro Agnew president. They work with their devout Mormons, some of them like Mr. Godfrey and a gang of them that live in Utah right now. They work with the FBI. And a member of the Minutemen called up the station and talked to Jim Eason and Seth Kanner and said that John Kennedy wasn't assassinated, he was eliminated, that he had to be eliminated, and the Minutemen played a part in it. Now that's interesting. He said that Lee Harvey Oswald was meeting with members of the Minutemen, and he didn't say much more about it, but he may give more information later. Lee Harvey Oswald did attend meetings of the John Birch Society in Dallas. He went with to General Walker's meetings with Michael Payne, and he met with people down in New Orleans that were active Minutemen, people against the civil rights actions of President John Kennedy. And the Minutemen did have connections to assassination teams in the Los Angeles Police Department, Evil Younger and Ed Davis, the Squad 19. And so earlier, it seems that the Minutemen were working with Lee Harvey Oswald. When I heard about that program on the air, I got out a memorandum I have from the National Archives dated November 29th, 1963, and it was from Special Agent Benavides in San Antonio, Texas. John Kennedy had been at San Antonio the day before he went to Fort Worth and Dallas, and it was sent to the Protective Research Section of the Secret Service, U.S. Secret Service. And the subject has to do with the Lieutenant Colonel L.L. Rivers, U.S. Army retired. The information was furnished by him. There's a blank. Enclosed is a communications from the FBI dated November 23, 1963. That's the day after John Kennedy was killed, regarding information furnished by Lieutenant Colonels L.L. Rivers, United States Army, retired. He lives in Harlingen, Texas, Harlingen, Harlingen, Texas, concerning information obtained from a stranger who in turn obtained it from an alleged pilot who claimed to belong to an organization called the Minutemen. It was stated that the president would be assassinated the next time he would come to Texas. The pilot had told the stranger that he was leaving Harlingen, Texas. He was going to Snow Aeronautics in West Texas, and that this corporation is located in Olney, Texas, and in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. He mentioned some corporation that is located in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. I just wonder if it has anything to do with Bell Aerospace, located in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Snow Aeronautics, if it's related to Bell Aerospace. But this has to do with allegations that a member of the Minutemen organization stated that John Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And then at the bottom, the FBI memorandum and the Secret Service said, no action will be taken by this office unless we are directed, which means that the Warren Commission, the FBI, never went into these allegations to see the links to the Minutemen or to locate these people who had information on the plans to kill John Kennedy. Those of you who have that position paper I wrote September 19th, 1976, know that the guidelines that I had for any investigation into the assassination of John Kennedy or Martin Luther King would have to follow certain directions in order to be a truthful investigation. And of course, I can take my suggested guidelines and measure them up to their performance, just those 17 days on the air, and show you where they went wrong. But the first thing I have down here, even more important than going into Marina Oswald, I said I'd do that this week, probably push it off till next, was the question of which witnesses had died up to the time the hearings would begin mysteriously or have been killed or are missing. And those of you who want to send for these guidelines, you can write to me and order them, and I'll get it out to you so you can follow. They're 10 pages, and you can follow these suggested guidelines of studying the assassinations. The first thing that I said should be followed is a list of people who have died, primary witnesses to the assassination, because I knew that up to the time and through the time that the House Select Committee was doing their work, primary witnesses would continue to be killed. So I thought it was important for the various researchers, Penn Jones and myself and other researchers, to sit down, because Penn had done the primary work on the death of witnesses, and make a list of every witness that we could compile who had died that was important to this investigation. The date that they died, that was to show the escalation of pressure, the increased deaths at the time Jim Garrison had arrested Clay Shaw, or the escalation of deaths after the Senator Church Committee and the beginning of this committee, how they died, whether they had cancer or thrown out of a building or their throats cut or automobile accidents or whatever, how they died, and what they would have told us about the assassination if they had lived. And that's very important, because just an example of covering the Oswald doubles, the House Select Committee pushed off the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had no doubles because 6 signatures matched each other, and therefore there were no doubles, because he wrote these various signatures. But there were 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds in the Texas School Book Depository. Sheriff Craig saw one leave the front of the Texas School Book Depository. He admitted that he was that person in the afternoon in Captain Fritz's office, and he talked to James Hosty and recognized James Hosty, the FBI man, and he mentioned Ruth Payne, who he lived with. And Mr. Worrell saw another Oswald leave from the back of the building. Well, Mr. Worrell died shortly after that. Sheriff Craig died. And then one Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have taken a bus and a taxi cab and gone to the rooming house. And the bus driver, the taxi cab driver, Arlene Roberts at the rooming house, they're all dead. And therefore, how would we know which Oswald was even at the rooming house or at the theater, or was one flown out of town. And it's very important to find out what these witnesses would have said, where they were at a particular time, so when this committee writes up their report, they just can't brush this all off, that their word is the last word, because these piles and piles of bodies are lined up, and we don't really get the story from them. The House Select Committee had a woman on just really fast about the day before the end. I haven't even transcribed her tape. She rushed off in about 17 minutes. I think the death of some witnesses that died up to 1967, and she gave their names and put down Penn Jones and made fun of the fact that his book was written in 1967 and that people like Earlene Roberts could have a heart attack and the calcium deposited in her body, and tried to imply that this wasn't a suspicious death. What they didn't say was that Earlene Roberts' sister, Bertha Cheek, was at Jack Ruby's home 3 weeks before the assassination, loaning or giving Jack Ruby about $17,000, and that Bertha Cheek is dead, and that a stripper, a friend of Jack Ruby's, was staying in the same rooming house with Lee Harvey Oswald. Here was Jack Ruby getting money from Earlene Roberts' sister. A stripper of Ruby's was staying at the rooming house, and now all those people, Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, Earlene Roberts, and Bertha Cheek, are all dead. They threw these names out in a hurry at the House Select Committee with total irreverence for the fact that there have been more deaths since 1967. And one of the committee members woke up from his long sleep like Rip Van Winkle and said, well, what about George de Mohrenschildt? And he suddenly caught on that de Mohrenschildt was a primary witness and didn't die in 1967. And, of course, that was passed off very quickly. But as the hearings went on, and it takes time to type up all the hearings every day, you'll be hearing names, and I'll print them up for you, of witnesses that they needed. And when they would refer to them, in some context, they were already deceased, and the testimony was based upon the bodies of these people that couldn't be called as primary witnesses, and therefore you have to take a grain of salt with what the testimony was using their names. William Sullivan's name came throughout the hearings. That name came up several times. George de Mohrenschildt's name was mentioned just briefly by Marina Oswald having a picture that belonged to George de Mohrenschildt. They didn't mention Dr. Gregory, very necessary for describing the wounds in John Connolly's wrist. Dr. Morton Halpern wasn't mentioned. He's the chief medical examiner of New York City, and I'll go to him in a little bit in alphabetical order. But he wrote a book. He wrote a section of a book called Where Death Delights in 1967, blasting the Warren Commission apart. The autopsy of John Kennedy, a critique of all the doctors, the methods, the techniques, as being totally atrocious. Then Dr. Halpern had got some kind of a little lingering disease and retired from New York City and was replaced by Dr. Michael Baden, B-A-D-E-N, the chief medical examiner of New York City. And then he came in and did the work and the testimony about the bullets and the wounds for the House Select Committee. It reminds me of Los Angeles, where Dr. Thomas Noguchi was fired, and they tried to replace him because a coroner, who later turned out to be a fraud, not a doctor or a lawyer, was saying justifiable homicides to all these blatant murders that Noguchi realized were murders and not justifiable homicides. So there was hanky-panky in the coroner's office in Los Angeles, and Noguchi fought to get himself reinstated on the facts. But Halpern got this lingering disease and was out, and was replaced by Dr. Michael Baden, and Halpern would have something very important to say about the corpse of John Kennedy if he were alive. John Hart testified to CIA men how the CIA considered liquidating this Yuri Nersenko, the KGB defector that came to the United States, and they used the word liquidate. They didn't know whether to put him in the loony bin or to liquidate him. And this is very important because I have a document that I've used on various programs, and you might have heard where they said that they can't say categorically in their Warren report, they can't write up there was no conspiracy involving Jack Ruby or any other persons. Consider Ruby as a conspiracy, they said, because Ruby is still alive and dickering for his fate. So we'll say that we have found no evidence of a conspiracy, but we can say no because he's still alive. Well, the way they put it, he's still dickering for his fate, means that they had a choice of killing him, liquidating him, the way John Hart said, or they could put him in the loony bin, and they chose that route so that the Ruby testimony could be all thrown out that he was just one big paranoid Jew and he had nothing to tell except his paranoias. They gave him the loony bin route to discredit because I guess they figured with Lee Harvey Oswald dead, it would look too fishy to kill Ruby or give him the lingering cancer after everybody can see how crazy he is. The secretary of the embassy in Mexico, the Cuban embassy, was killed in a car crash. And after she was killed in her little Volkswagen, a few weeks later, she was replaced by Sylvia Duran, who has been alleged to be a CIA agent and suspected of being a CIA agent. And then when Lee Harvey Oswald went to the Cuban embassy, Sylvia Duran was there saying that Lee Harvey Oswald had been at the agency. We heard the testimony of another witness say absolutely it was a double, that wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. But 2 days after the assassination of John Kennedy, Sylvia Duran was removed in the custody of the Mexican police and, in quotes, protected, I guess kept from the investigators. But in order for her to have that job, the secretary before her was murdered, and then Sylvia came in. Lyndon Johnson, we were told at the hearings, was informed of the plans to kill Fidel Castro and the use of organized crime, along with the Central Intelligence Agency, that he had knowledge of that. And of course, when Lyndon Johnson said, "We have a murder incorporated in the Caribbean," I always said that he meant just that. We have a murder incorporated in the Caribbean. And 3 months later, Lyndon Johnson was dead. We know he had had some other heart attacks various times, but LBJ was dead shortly after he learned about the murder teams in the Caribbean, and with him was Mike Howard of the Secret Service, who was Marina Oswald's agent at the time of the assassination, who took care of her. A big part of the hearings involved a man named Homer Clark, who wrote for National Enquirer in 1972, and he alleged to have seen Fidel Castro and had a conversation with Castro, and they talked about the plans to kill Fidel Castro, and Castro was to retaliate and kill John Kennedy, and this was in the National Enquirer. The National Enquirer is owned by a man from the CIA. Homer Clark is dead. The story, according to Castro, was planted. It was a provocation to blame him for John Kennedy's death, and I'm sure Fidel Castro is right about that. But that, again, is another primary witness that they haggled and talked about, this particular Homer Clark, and they wondered about Sylvia Duran's testimony and Lee Harvey Oswald at the Cuban embassy in Mexico. But the secretary that came in first, as I say, is dead, and Homer Clark is dead. Now, when Richard Helms was testifying about Lee Harvey Oswald, and they were asking him about Lee Harvey Oswald in the Navy, and Richard Helms says, "Well, why are you asking me about him? Call Navy intelligence." He threw out the name of Rufus Taylor, and he mentioned, well, Rufus Taylor just died last week. And many of you may not have seen the article in the Washington Post about Rufus Taylor. I'm going to give you a description of him because he's an important witness, and he died just the week before Richard Helms was testifying. And this is the rundown of Rufus Taylor, probably a witness as important as George de Mohrenschildt to this story. You hear my dog scratching on the door. I guess I'll let him in. He's still bothering me, the poor thing, and he wants some attention while I'm doing these tapes. Rufus Taylor was a graduate of Annapolis Naval Academy. He studied in Tokyo from 1938 to 1941, native of St. Louis, Missouri. I think of James Earl Ray and the St. Louis, Missouri breakout in the prison with the warden that I understand is from the Bay of Pigs operation. He's never been investigated. Rufus Taylor was with General MacArthur after the war in Japan, and he was the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence for the entire Pacific Fleet. He was in Japan from 1941 to 1959 in Japan in Navy intelligence, U.S. intelligence. At the time, Lee Harvey Oswald was over there in 1959 in the Philippines and at Sugi at the air bases of the U-2. He served, Lee Harvey Oswald served in the Marines with top secret security clearance at the U-2 bases at a time where Vice Admiral Rufus Taylor was stationed in Japan in charge of the intelligence for the Pacific Fleet. When Lee Harvey Oswald went to the Soviet Union, Rufus Taylor went to Washington, D.C., And Lee Harvey Oswald said, "I'm going to give away radar information." But Rufus Taylor then became the assistant director for foreign intelligence over in the Soviet Union, where Lee Harvey Oswald was going to be. Lee Harvey Oswald was in Russia from 1959 to 62, and Taylor was in charge of foreign intelligence then at that time. Taylor was director of Navy intelligence in 1963 up until the time that John Kennedy was killed. He was in charge of Navy intelligence. In 1963 to 1966, that's after the John Kennedy assassination and just prior to Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy's assassination, he was working for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'll turn this tape over and we'll do more about Vice Admiral Rufus Taylor. This is side 2 of tape number 357, October the 6th, 1978. Rufus Taylor went on in 1967 to 1969 to be the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the number 2 post under Richard Helms, the CIA director. And those were the years when Permindex and the international cartels were working along with the Solidaris, the White Russian community, the syndicate, the gaming, the Pentagon, the FBI, Division 5 of the FBI, described in the Torbett document, all behind all of these assassinations. There was a connecting link behind all of them. And in 1967 to 69, Vice Admiral Rufus Taylor was under Richard Helms. So the importance of these deaths, you can see how people are still alive at the time the committee is formed. They're not called. The committee waited till he was dead. Richard Helms mentions his name. Richard Helms testified September 22nd, 1978, before the House Select Committee, and Rufus Taylor died September the 14th, 8 days earlier, 1978. So he had a career in Japan in Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence with the Pacific Fleet when Oswald was in Japan with the U-2. He was in charge of Assistant Director of Foreign Intelligence when Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union, Director of Navy Intelligence up through 63 when John Connally was Secretary of the Navy and was involved down the allegations of the Torbett document down in Tyrol Bay. And then Mr. Taylor goes on to the Defense Intelligence Agency, which has been named in the assassinations of John, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and Deputy Director of the CIA under Richard Helms. A very important person, and somebody that should have been interviewed a long time ago. Not that he would have given out much information. They're sworn to secrecy, and these are terrible years to be opening up these murders and conspiracies, but I think they're concealed not for the shame or disgrace of what transpired, but because of the future plans that would be interfered with, and that's what they would be afraid of. Now, there was another witness that was mentioned briefly, just I think Richard Helms talked about in terms of opening mail. They said to him, "Weren't you concerned, Lee Harvey Oswald, a defector? Didn't you know that you opened the mail for every Boy Scout that came through? How come you weren't interested in Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union?" And I believe one of the members of Congress thought that was almost an impossibility. Well, there was a mention about Mr. Thomas Karamessines, Karamessines. I'll give it to you on your printed slip. Karamessines was another important man like Mr. Rufus Taylor. He died Labor Day, just before his name was mentioned in the October session, September sessions before the House Select Committee. And probably you didn't even see his name. If you have or buy the books, the Intelligence Activity Hearings, Volume 4, the mail openings for the Senator Church Committee, Mr. Karamessines' name comes in there. He had legal training. He practiced law. He was chief of the clandestine service when Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union. And they said, "Why didn't you tell the Justice Department or the FBI about opening mail? The FBI is in charge of internal security in the United States. The CIA is not supposed to be in this business in the USA of opening mail, but the CIA didn't tell the FBI they were opening it or why. And the testimony goes on that it started out as an operational effort of our Soviet division. The Soviet division was taking mail, and I had once heard that Lee Harvey Oswald was writing to his brothers, John Pick and Robert Oswald, who served the intelligence community. That's what I've heard from several sources, but of course that's never been investigated, that he used microdotting of what was going on in the Soviet Union to write to his family. I'm sure we only had 8 or 10 defectors over there at the time. One of them was Lee Harvey Oswald's friend. They later met in Georgia, and he had acquaintances that were over there as spies. So they had an operational effort in the Soviet Union. It was a counterintelligence operation, clandestine services. Mr. Karamazin was chief of the clandestine service. There wasn't anything in the local newspapers here. I talked to Sherman Skolnick in Chicago. There wasn't anything in Chicago for a week. He died in Canada, and there wasn't any mention in the Canadian papers that he died, and yet he was responsible for the mail openings at the time. Lee Harvey Oswald was a defector in the Soviet Union and said that he was going to give his information to the Soviet Union, and we were supposed to be changing our radar boards here in the Pacific Fleet because Oswald had access to all of that information. As I say, the witness to the John Kennedy assassination that would have helped with the autopsy if he were alive was Dr. Milton Halpern. You can get that book, Where Death Delights. It's put out by Coward McCann, New York City, 1967, and he tells about performing over 60,000 autopsies and 10,000 gunshot wounds, and he talks about Commander Hume, who had only done medicine in peacetime, the Commander Boswell, who had no expertise in forensic pathology, Colonel Fink, who said he did 200 autopsies in Frankfurt, Germany, but only 2 of them were bullet cases, and present at the autopsy was the Surgeon General of the Navy, Admiral Galloway, commanding officer of the Navy, Captain John Stover, Navy Medical School. He lists the people there, and he tells how they didn't probe manually for a bullet that was in John Kennedy, and that they didn't use the x-rays or the photographs, and that there was secrecy. And he said in 1967 there was secrecy on the x-rays and pictures. The secrecy is still going on. I don't agree with the Warren Commission conclusions that only 2 bullets caused all of the wounds suffered by John Connally and John Kennedy. There is nothing in the Zapruder frames to rule out that John Kennedy was hit before the sign, and he claims it would be impossible. He has the same statements as Dr. Cyril Wecht had, that they would be impossible to only have those 2 bullets, and that they didn't manually probe for bullets, and they excluded the possibility that there were bullets in the body of John Kennedy. But by the time Dr. Milton Halpern was dead, he died in 1977, March 23rd, 1977, the House Select Committee was using testimony about the autopsy, but had not used his knowledge while he was still alive. And he was in San Diego speaking or traveling when he passed away, and I'm sure that he would have good memory on this for that particular committee. And as I mentioned, Comer Clark, the great writer from National Enquirer, he wrote articles on British girls as Nazi sex slaves, and I was Hitler's secret love. He has a quotation from Fidel Castro: "It's possible I could have saved him, Kennedy. I might have been able to, but I didn't. I never believed the plan would be put into effect. I thought Oswald must have been a nut." The implication here is that Castro knew that Kennedy was going to be killed. Then the House Select Committee answers back Mr. Blakey that saying this article is not without some substance. Clark may never have interviewed Fidel Castro as claimed, but the substance is supported by, in quotes, highly confidential but reliable sources available to the U.S. government. Of course, from the DISC, Defense Industry Security Command, or the NSA, or the CIA, or the DIA, they have some expert sources that this was said to Homer Clark, even though he lied and didn't see Fidel Castro and has no great record as a historian. Another interesting witness died this last week whose name wasn't mentioned in the testimony, and Alan Blanchard, Blanchard, in Washington, D.C. at the time of the hearings. He died September the 18th, 1978. He was 49 years old. He comes from Detroit, Michigan, the Gerald Ford, Henry Ford area that I watch so closely because that's where John Kennedy's car is deposited, in the basement of the Ford Motor Company there. He was chief of the Washington bureau of the Detroit News, and he had a lot of involvement. He was at the right place at the right time. News-wise, he was in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. He was in Dominican Republic in 1965 when the American troops intervened there. He covered the trial of Jack Ruby for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. He was an award-winning journalist, and I was interested in his trial of Jack Ruby. He died last week of Legionnaire's disease, a very convenient disease coming through air conditioning, I understand. I wonder what he knew about the Jack Ruby trial for the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. He's the only known person to die of Legionnaire's disease in Washington, D.C., and he represented the Detroit News Bureau. He's here no more. Now I have a list of witnesses that have died because, as I said at the beginning of this tape, the primary thing in investigating these assassinations is to chart out how these people died, who they were, what information they would have given you if they'd been alive. I'm going to read you the names as much as I have time for on this tape, and I hope maybe I can get them all out. This won't give you much information. I won't go into all the various ways they died because someday I'll do a book and chart and graphs on them, but I want to give you the listing of some primary witnesses that died with regard to the assassination of John Kennedy. I have 123 names here. I'll warn you now. 123 names and 8 or 10 whose lives were threatened if they talked anymore. Now, if I run through these names and you transcribe the tape and you have more, please send them to me because I might have missed somebody. This is just all I have, but you might add to my list. And right now they're in alphabetical order, not year-wise, but if they were close to the hearings, I'll tell you. One was Manuel Artime, who died in 1977. Anyone who died 76, 77, and 78 is a primary witness because the decision to open up the Kennedy assassination in Congress began in 76 when I wrote that position paper. At the time I wrote the position paper. Manuel Artime was a member of the CIA assassination teams. He worked closely with the anti-Castro Cubans, E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis. Charles Batchelor, Assistant Chief of Police in Dallas, the man who escorted Lee Harvey Oswald down the ramp when he was killed. Alan Belmont, August 77, former assistant to J. Edgar Hoover. He worked with the Warren Commission, and his name came up during these 17 days of hearing. Eddie Benavides, a witness to his brother was a witness to the Tippit murder. He was shot in the head. The killer was never found. Guy Bannister, an FBI partner of Robert Mayhew in Chicago. He went down to New Orleans and set up an office that backed up to where Lee Harvey Oswald worked. Jack Beers, he's the gentleman who took the picture of the tramps at Dealey Plaza. The question of whether they're E. Howard Hunt or Frank Sturgis has not been resolved. Mary Bledsoe, the woman on the bus with Lee Harvey Oswald after the assassination, also had rented a room at her house to him previously. Alan Blanchard, that's the newspaper man I just mentioned, who died last week, who covered Jack Ruby trial. Albert Guy Bogart, a witness to the John Kennedy assassination, a gentleman from the Lincoln Mercury car agency who said Lee Harvey Oswald had been there and was wanting some kind of a getaway car. Hale Boggs of Louisiana, who died in a plane crash in Alaska, a member of the Warren Commission who was putting pieces together of the Watergate Kennedy assassination. He was investigating Watergate and took a plane trip and never came back. Lee Powers, a witness from the overpass, the grassy knoll area of the Kennedy assassination. There was a babushka woman, a woman on the grassy knoll with a scarf over her head. Her husband was part of the crime syndicate in Texas. He died. I think Penn Jones has more information about him and knew that he was part of the crime syndicate, and he's never been identified publicly, but various persons had described him in this way. Daniel Burroughs, head of the Nazi Party in the United States, along with Rockwell. His name was in Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook. Comer Clark, I mentioned, the gentleman from the National Enquirer. Joe Cooper, he was a writer for Tatler magazine that went out of print, made important links to the Kennedy assassination to the Baton Rouge connections and to Navy intelligence. He was closer to the line than almost any person I know, with the exception of myself, and Joe had a lot of articles in the Tatler, was blown up. Roger Craig, the sheriff in Dallas, who saw Lee Harvey Oswald leave in Michael Payne's car, Ruth Payne's car. from the front of the building. Fred Lee Chrisman died in 1975. He's from the CIA, the defense agency, disguised as a priest at Grassy Knoll. His name was mentioned and recognized in the pictures before the House Select Committee. They ruled out Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt, but said, yes, that's Fred Chrisman. His home base was up, I believe, Boeing aircraft up in the Seattle area and also down in New Orleans. Austin Cook, a member of the Minutemen, ran a drive-in in Dallas and was familiar with Officer Tippett. I have Marie Callas's name here, the opera singer. She died very quickly in September 1977, just a year ago. She was going to write a book, which she said in quotes, to tell everything I know. She was very close to Aristotle Onassis, and I'm very suspicious of the links of Aristotle Onassis to various Germans and people in Argentina or possible information on the assassination. I understand he had a book with the whole blueprint of the assassination. And just at the time that she was writing a book in perfect health and was working on the book and had mentioned it, she dropped dead. And I think that the whole Onassis family, Alexander Onassis, Aristotle Onassis, and Marie Callas, died because of information they had on the Kennedy assassination that would cause people to seek further or overseas for links to the murder. Charles Cabell, a former CIA official, died in 1971. He was a deputy director of the CIA in charge of the Bay of Pigs. He went into the hospital for a routine check, and he died while he was in the hospital. He had been fired along with Allen Dulles from the Central Intelligence Agency by John Kennedy. His brother was mayor of Dallas when John Kennedy was killed. James Candigan was a firearms expert. He testified before the Warren Commission. Rose Cherami was an employee of Jack Ruby, who hinted there was a conspiracy and died in a terrible automobile accident. Henry Carter also knew of the Ruby connections, Jack Ruby's links in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and was close to Hank Killam. James Chaney escorted John Kennedy to Parkland Hospital. He was a Dallas police officer. He saw John Kennedy struck in the face. He was never called as a witness. William Cheshire had information on Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. Bertha Cheek is the woman I mentioned earlier on the tape who offered Jack Ruby money in terms of a loan, allegedly a loan, but he was to come into money. She was the sister of Earlene Roberts, also dead, who ran the rooming house where Lee Harvey Oswald lived. Interesting, the House Select Committee, in going into motives of Jack Ruby that they barely passed over, or possible links to organized crime, and we'll go into this at length later, doesn't go into the contacts with people like H.L. Hunt in Texas, or Warren Carroll of the CIA, or Bertha Cheek. Dr. Nicholas Chetta, he did autopsies in New Orleans on David Ferry, Robert Perrin, another victim of the Kennedy assassination. He'd given truth serum to Perry Russo, that was Jim Garrison's witness when Jim Garrison had arrested Clay Shaw. John Crawford, a close friend of Jack Ruby. He not only knew Jack Ruby, but he was close with Mr. Buell Frazier, the man that drove Lee Harvey Oswald to the Texas School Book Depository the morning of the assassination, and was instrumental in getting the job for Lee Harvey Oswald. Ruth Payne lived across the street from Mr. Frazier's relatives, and Ruth Payne asked about a job for the husband of the woman living at her place, and she said, well, my family, I believe it was her brother, worked, I forget, it's been so many years since I read that testimony. Her brother, Buell Frazier, drove to the depository. She could take Lee Harvey Oswald. John Crawford was a friend of both Frazier and Jack Ruby. Professor Henry Dulon, he was a brother-in-law of Dr. Cheto in New Orleans. He worked at the coroner's office. He died of a suspicious death and had information on the assassinations. Eladio DeValle was a friend of David Ferry's, worked with the anti-Castro Cubans, the CIA. The same day that David Ferry died in New Orleans, his friend DeValle died in Miami. They both worked in the city where John Kennedy was supposed to be killed 3 weeks earlier. When David Ferry was arrested, right after he was arrested by Jim Garrison, or was going to be arrested, Clay Shaw had been, Ferry died, and his friend in Miami died the same day. George de Mohrenschildt died in March 1977. Contacts the CIA, the DIA, the Nazis, the Rockefellers, Oswald's control agent, nicknamed the Chinaman, at a time when the House Select Committee, Mr. Fonzie, was about to see him. Donald Donaldson died, this was December 1977, an associate of George de Mohrenschildt and Wilhelm Altman, who had information of the plot allegedly linking to the Rockefeller connections. Sheffield Edwards died in 1975 after appearing before Senator Church's committee. Oh, that must have been 76 then, because that committee ended in 76 in time for the elections. A CIA contact with Robert Mayhew, and he was a part of the team that hired John Rosselli and Sam Giancana. Sheffield Edwards was a liaison of the CIA to that group, and of course Mayhew worked under the umbrella of the Howard Hughes Organization. Mr. J.M. English, who headed the Forensic Science Lab in 1966 and in 1963, the FBI lab, died in 1977, so new experts could be brought in. Remember that at this hearing, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, they didn't use the same bullets that the FBI used in 1964. And this gentleman worked with the FBI lab and worked with the forensic FBI department. Clayton Fowler, Jack Ruby's defense lawyer, the one that worked with Jack Ruby during the polygraph test, died. David Ferry, the gentleman worked with Mr. Diwali. He worked also with Carlos Marcello in the New Orleans area. He worked with the CIA, the pilot, the gentleman with the suspicious backgrounds who was working with cancer in mice and was a hypnotist. An interesting background. He died in 1967. Carlo Gambino died in 1975. He worked closely with Vito Genovese, the syndicate family. Jack Ruby had contacts, according to Nancy Perrin Rich. She was with Jack Ruby. He was doing some gun running and was with the military and the CIA and Vito Genovese and a general, and she and her husband got frightened, and her husband went on to New Orleans from the Dallas area where he died of poisoning. Earl Wayne Garner, suspected of witnessing the Tippit murder. There were threats on his life by Dallas police officials. He died in 1970. Maurice Brooks Gatlin died in 1964 with links to the CIA, to the FBI, to Guy Bannister, to Permindex, and was familiar and associated with people named in the assassination plans to kill John Kennedy and also the attempts on Charles de Gaulle. He worked with Jerry Brooks and fell out of a sixth-floor window. Sam Giancana, part of a team with Robert Mayhew of the CIA assassination team, died just before he was to be called before Senator Church's committee. Oh, it was in 1975. David Goldstein was the man who traced the weapon that was used to murder J.D. Tippit. He died in 1965. Jesus Gonzalez Carta worked with Rolando Masferrer, who later, they worked with Alpha 66, the anti-Castro Cuban groups. He was paid $200,000 to kill the president of Costa Rica. He was part of the assassination teams. Alexander Guterma, he died in 1977, a white Russian exile involved with the Galen operation and with George de Mohrenschildt. Bill Hunter, a reporter in Jack Ruby's apartment, was there November 24th, 1963, died. Tom Howard, Jack Ruby's first attorney, he was seen in the police department basement when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot. Larry Harris, Penn Jones wrote about Larry Harris. I'm not familiar with his importance in the case. In continuing inquiry, he has information on the death of a witness, Larry Harris, which I didn't look up before I made this tape. I'll have to check out Penn's article. William Harvey of the CIA provided the weapons and the killing for the assassination teams of the organized crime, and the CIA worked with Sheffield Edwards and Robert Mayhew. Remember that they keep talking about John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, witnesses to the Kennedy assassination from organized crime who died. They always leave out the name of Sheffield Edwards and William Harvey, the two connecting links of the members of organized crime to the CIA. Milton Halpern, I mentioned before, who exposed the John Kennedy autopsy and said there's no way that the bullets that went through John Connally and John Kennedy would line up to be two bullets. Lisa Howard, a journalist, a go-between, a liaison of Fidel Castro, and diplomatic talks between John Kennedy and Fidel Castro. Marguerite Higgins accused the USA of complicity in killing DM, another writer, and just before the John Kennedy assassination, she was aware of joint conspiracies. Jimmy Hoffa, again, links to the John Kennedy assassination, his hatred of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, his close association with Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana. His name comes up frequently with regards to the Kennedys and how John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had prosecuted him and put him in jail, and he hated them with a vengeance because he was tying up these syndicate families by having the Justice Department investigate them. S.M. Holland, a witness to the shootings of John Kennedy at the grassy knoll. Walter Hadley, Jr., the police chief who made tapes at the police department in Miami on the details to kill John Kennedy 3 weeks before John Kennedy was killed in Dallas, Texas. Those were the plans that involved Joseph Miltier, who later was supposed to be in Dealey Plaza. The hearings this last week discounted Miltier as not being there because he's only 5'4". I don't know where they got those measurements. They said the man that looked exactly like him was shorter, but they also mentioned that people's heights vary inches because of various shoes they wear and the position of the camera. But Miltier had worked with this particular man in Miami. Hobart Higgins is a pilot who flew private planes to South America that could have been involved with a getaway of the Oswald doubles. He had links to Jack Ruby. J. Edgar Hoover died in May 1972, and Philip De Diego said that the White House plumbers had poisoned him, that he knew too much, and J. Edgar Hoover would have had the information, certainly, of William Sullivan, Division 5, and the political assassinations. Mrs. Dorothy Hunt, the wife of E. Howard Hunt, was killed in a plane over Chicago at a time where the White House was talking about the Watergate going back to the Bay of Pigs, which was a code name, actually, for the Kennedy assassination. I'm sure that they realized that the story would have to open up and unfold going back to that date with Frank Fiorina and Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt. And she was on an airplane traveling with money and information going back to the Bay of Pigs when her plane was blown up. Hiram Ingram, a close friend of Roger Craig, the sheriff from Dallas County that was murdered, was killed. Reverend Clyde Johnson, a key witness to the Clay Shaw trial, made connections of Lee Harvey Oswald to Clay Shaw, attended parties where David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, and attended, and was to testify before Jim Garrison's committee, said that Ruby was at these parties, but like David Ferry, he never made them. Before this tape runs out and we get to the other tape, because there's only a certain amount of time, and I will begin next week's tape with some more of these death witnesses because I think they're terribly important. There's one name here that I don't want to miss because I mentioned part of a testimony on a tape last week, 2 weeks ago, and I want you to look that up. It has to do with Buddy Walters. Buddy Walters, his name is Eddie Raymond Buddy, died in 1969. He was a member of the Dallas Police Department, and he claimed that over in the area at the grassy knoll where everyone was running, that he picked up a caliber slug, a .45 caliber slug in the grass. Now, this is some of the evidence that's missing. Buddy Walters claims that he had that as a policeman, and that .45 caliber slug, of course, was never presented as evidence in the investigation of the assassination to kill John Kennedy. Those of you who take the tapes regularly have tape cassette number 346, August the 18th, 1978, side 1. And in that tape, I talk about a book that is coming out in England. Somebody was over in Europe and had information that is there, but it's hard to get, called Treason for My Daily Bread by Mikhail Lebedev, Russian Nazi agent. And this book was reviewed in June of 1977, Valenci Press in London. And in this book, they allege that Martin Bormann sent an agent killer to the United States who fired the fatal bullet on John Kennedy, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a decoy, that Zed is the code name for the man who did the fatal bullet over by the fence, and that he fired a .45 bullet. Now, I think that's interesting that this book is coming out talking about a .45 bullet because Buddy Walters, as a police officer in the Dallas area, said he found a .45 caliber slug in the grass. Now, I don't know how bullets fire, and I'm not that informed about them, but I'm sure if there were somebody shooting and he had to make a quick getaway to the railroad cars, or someone going to the cars later, might have been one of those tramps that was taken off that did the fatal headshot, they would know that they're setting up Oswald as a patsy. We've heard that from Joseph Miltier, from the Miami police, and from many sources, and Lee Harvey Oswald said, "I'm a patsy." So a .45 caliber slug could be thrown in the grass. Buddy Walters picks it up, everybody laughs, and nobody believes that the Dallas police won't touch it, the FBI won't touch it, and I don't know where it is or what happened to it, But then he was killed and was given a big policeman's funeral. But this might be the very thing that matches to that assassin by the name of Zad. I'll get back to the list of names of people that I think are important witnesses that have died under unusual circumstances or very young. Their deaths should be looked into. And I won't have time on this tape to complete them, so I'll start the tape for next week and put them right on that tape. Lyndon Johnson, January 1973. I mentioned him before. It's important because his name came up during the hearings that he did in fact know about the assassination team of organized crime and the Central Intelligence Agency. And in alphabetical order under that is Thomas Karamazine, that is the chief of clandestine services that I talked about. Him. He passed away Labor Day this year, 1978. Dorothy Kilgallen, about to break the story of the assassination of John Kennedy. She was with Jack Ruby for a few moments. There's an entire book coming out about the murder of Dorothy Kilgallen. She's one of the names that was run off by the House Select Committee during the televised hearings, just a series of names. They quickly gave 17 names that died before 1967 and didn't even make note of the fact that an entire book is being written about Dorothy Kilgallen. Hank Killam, his wife, worked for Jack Ruby. A close friend of his lived with Lee Harvey Oswald at the rooming house at Beckley Street. And, of course, Ruby had the other contacts with Bertha Cheek, the sister of Earlene Roberts, who had the rooming house where Lee Harvey Oswald stayed. We're going to continue the deaths now on the other side and get into the evidence that's missing.